My childhood best friend proposed to my ex behind my back, but what came next made him wish he never did. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who hurt you the most, and I learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible. I'm Oliver, and I'm 30 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened 8 months ago, but the betrayal still cuts deep every time I think about it. This is about my childhood best friend Mason and my ex-girlfriend Sophia, and how they both taught me that some friendships and relationships aren't worth the pain they cause. Mason and I have been best friends since we were 7 years old. We met on the first day of second grade when he was the new kid who moved in 3 houses down from mine. I was shy and awkward and Mason was outgoing and confident, but somehow we just clicked. We became inseparable, spending every afternoon after school together riding bikes, building forts, and getting into the kind of harmless trouble that makes childhood memorable. Throughout elementary school, middle school, and high school, Mason and I were like brothers. We played on the same sports teams, went to the same summer camps, and even got our first jobs at the same grocery store when we turned 16. Our families became close too, with regular barbecues, holiday gatherings, and shared vacations. Mason's parents treated me like their own son, and my parents did the same for him. What made our friendship work was that we complemented each other perfectly. Mason was the social one who could talk to anyone and make friends easily, while I was more thoughtful and analytical. He'd push me out of my comfort zone, and I'd keep him grounded when his impulsiveness got him into trouble. We trusted each other completely and never had any major conflicts or jealousy issues. After high school, we both stayed local for college and got an apartment together. Those were some of the best years of our friendship. We had the freedom of being adults, but still maintained the easy camaraderie we'd always shared. We studied together, partied together, and supported each other through the ups and downs of college life. That's where Sophia enters the story. I met her during my junior year in a literature class where we were both English majors. Sophia was beautiful, smart, and had this infectious laugh that could light up any room. She was also passionate about writing and had dreams of becoming a novelist someday. I was completely smitten from the moment I first heard her talk about her favorite books. Mason liked Sophia immediately when I introduced them. He said she was perfect for me and encouraged me to ask her out, even though I was nervous about potentially ruining our friendship if things didn't work out. Mason was actually the one who convinced me to finally make a move by pointing out that I'd regret it forever if I didn't try. Sophia and I dated for 2.5 years. She fit seamlessly into our friend group and got along great with Mason and our other college buddies. The three of us would hang out together regularly, and Sophia often joked that she was dating both of us since Mason and I were practically attached at the hip. I thought she was amused by our close friendship rather than bothered by it. Our relationship was solid and comfortable. We had similar interests, shared the same values, and talked about getting married after graduation. Sophia met my parents and extended family, and they all loved her. Mason would often tell me how lucky I was to have found someone so perfect and how he hoped he'd find someone like her someday. But during our senior year, things started to change between Sophia and me. The pressure of figuring out our post-graduation plans started to create tension in our relationship. Sophia had been accepted to a competitive graduate writing program 3 states away, while I had a job offer from a local marketing firm. We tried to make long-distance work, but the strain was obvious. Sophia became distant and started picking fights about small things. She'd make comments about how I wasn't ambitious enough or how I was too comfortable staying in our hometown instead of pursuing bigger opportunities. She'd compare me unfavorably to other people in our program who were moving to big cities or taking risks with their careers. The end came 6 months after graduation. Sophia had been in her graduate program for a semester, and our phone calls had become increasingly infrequent and strained. When she came home for Christmas break, she told me she thought we should take a break to figure out what we really wanted. She said the distance was too hard and that maybe we'd grown in different directions. I was devastated, but I understood her reasoning. Long-distance relationships are difficult, and we were both young and trying to establish our careers. We agreed to stay friends and to keep the door open for getting back together if circumstances changed. Sophia moved her remaining belongings out of my apartment, and we had what I thought was an amicable breakup. Mason was incredibly supportive during this difficult time. He let me crash at his place when being in my apartment felt too lonely. He listened to me vent about missing Sophia and wondering if I'd made the wrong choice by staying local instead of following her to graduate school. He assured me that I'd done the right thing and that if Sophia couldn't appreciate what I had to offer, then she wasn't the right person for me. For the next several months, Mason helped me get back on my feet emotionally. We started hanging out more like we had in college, going to bars, watching sports, and just enjoying each other's company. I was grateful to have such a loyal friend who was willing to help me through one of the most difficult periods of my life. What I didn't know was that Mason had been in contact with Sophia the entire time. What I didn't know was that he'd been offering her the same emotional support he was giving me, except his motives weren't nearly as pure as I'd believed. What I didn't know was that my best friend was about to betray me in a way that would destroy both our friendship and any remaining feelings I had for the woman I'd once planned to marry. About 4 months after Sophia and I broke up, I started noticing some changes in Mason's behavior that seemed odd, but not necessarily alarming. He'd get text messages that would make him smile in this secretive way, and when I'd ask who was texting him, he'd just say it was work or family. He started being less available for our usual hangout sessions, claiming he had plans with other friends or obligations I'd never heard him mention before. Mason had always been social and had friends outside our immediate circle, so I didn't think much of his busier schedule at first. I figured he was just trying to give me space to heal from the breakup and maybe exploring new social opportunities now that we weren't spending every weekend as a trio with Sophia. I was actually grateful that he wasn't hovering over me like some kind of protective guardian. But then I started noticing more specific changes that made me uncomfortable. Mason would sometimes bring up Sophia in casual conversation, asking how I thought she was doing in graduate school or whether I'd heard from her lately. When I'd say I hadn't been in contact with her, he'd nod like he was just making small talk, but something about his tone felt off. He also started making comments about long-distance relationships and whether they could ever really work. He'd mention articles he'd read about couples who'd made it work despite being apart, and success stories of people who'd gotten back together after taking breaks. At the time, I thought he was trying to be encouraging and maybe hoping Sophia and I would eventually reconcile. The truth started to come out in the most mundane way possible. I was at Mason's apartment helping him move some furniture when his phone buzzed with a text message. He was carrying a heavy dresser at the time, so he asked me to check the message and let him know if it was important. When I picked up his phone, I saw a preview of a text from someone listed in his contacts as S. The message preview said, "Can't wait to see you this weekend," with a heart emoji. I felt my stomach drop as I realized that S was probably Sophia and that Mason had been in contact with her without telling me. When I told him he had a text from S, he nearly dropped his end of the dresser and quickly said it wasn't important. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Maybe S wasn't Sophia. Maybe it was someone else Mason was dating, and he just hadn't mentioned her to me yet. But the secretive way he'd reacted when I mentioned the text made me suspicious. I decided to pay closer attention to his behavior to see if I could figure out what was really going on. Over the next few weeks, I started to piece together a pattern that made my suspicions grow stronger. Mason would step out of the room to take certain phone calls. He'd be protective of his phone in ways he'd never been before. He'd mention plans for the weekend, but be vague about details when I'd ask what he was doing or who he was hanging out with. The confirmation came when I saw Mason at a restaurant across town where I'd gone for a work lunch. I was sitting by the window waiting for my colleagues when I spotted him at a table in the corner with someone whose back was to me. When the woman turned around, I saw that it was definitely Sophia. They were sitting close together, holding hands across the table and talking intimately like a couple. I sat there watching them for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. My best friend and my ex-girlfriend were clearly on a date. They looked comfortable together, like this wasn't their first time meeting up. Mason was acting the same way around Sophia that he used to act around girls he was interested in during college, animated and flirtatious, and completely focused on her. I left the restaurant without my colleagues arriving and drove around for an hour trying to figure out what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately, but another part of me hoped there was some innocent explanation for what I'd witnessed. Maybe they'd run into each other and decided to catch up. Maybe Sophia was in town visiting other friends, and Mason had offered to show her around. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. The body language I'd observed wasn't that of two people having a casual, friendly meal. Mason and Sophia were involved romantically, and they'd been hiding it from me while I confided in Mason about missing her and wondering if we'd ever get back together. That evening, Mason came over to my apartment like nothing had happened. He asked about my day, listened to me talk about work problems, and suggested we watch a movie together. I kept waiting for him to mention seeing Sophia or to confess that there was something he needed to tell me. Instead, he acted completely normal, like he hadn't just spent the afternoon on a date with my ex-girlfriend. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying every interaction I'd had with Mason since my breakup with Sophia, looking for signs that I'd missed. I thought about all the times he'd asked about her and all the encouraging things he'd said about long-distance relationships and second chances. I realized he'd been gathering information about my feelings while pursuing her behind my back. The next few days were torture. I went back and forth between wanting to confront Mason and wanting to see how far he'd take his deception. I also started wondering how long their relationship had been going on. Had they been talking while Sophia and I were still together? Had Mason been waiting for us to break up so he could make his move? Had he maybe even encouraged our breakup in subtle ways I hadn't recognized? 2 weeks later, I got my answer when Mason asked if we could talk. He seemed nervous and kept fidgeting with his hands as he told me he had something important to share. He said he'd been meaning to tell me sooner, but hadn't known how to bring it up. Then he dropped the bomb that would end our friendship forever. Mason told me he'd been in contact with Sophia since shortly after our breakup. He said it had started innocently with her reaching out to check on how I was doing, but had evolved into something more personal. He claimed they'd discovered they had feelings for each other that they'd never recognized before, and that they were now in a serious relationship. But the worst part was yet to come. Mason told me he was planning to propose to Sophia and wanted my blessing before he asked her to marry him. I stared at Mason for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what he'd just told me. My childhood best friend wanted my blessing to propose to my ex-girlfriend after conducting a secret relationship behind my back for months. The audacity of his request was almost more shocking than the betrayal itself. How long, I finally managed to ask. How long have you two been together? Mason looked uncomfortable and avoided eye contact. It's complicated, he said. We started talking as friends, but feelings developed gradually. It wasn't something either of us planned. That's not what I asked, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. How long have you been dating Sophia? Officially about 3 months, Mason admitted. But we've been talking since January. January was only a month after Sophia and I had broken up. While I was crying on Mason's shoulder about losing the love of my life, he was already making his move on her. While I was confiding in him about whether I should try to win her back, he was working to ensure that would never happen. Did you encourage our breakup, I asked. Did you tell Sophia she should end things with me? Mason's face went red. Of course not, Oliver. I would never do that. When she reached out to me, she was already having doubts about your relationship. I just listened and offered support. The same support you were offering me, I said. Except you were telling her what she wanted to hear instead of encouraging her to work things out with me. Mason tried to defend himself. Look, I know this is awkward, but Sophia and I really care about each other. We didn't mean for it to happen this way, but sometimes you can't control who you fall in love with. Love, I repeated. You love her? Yes, Mason said firmly. I love her, and she loves me. That's why I want to marry her. I know it's complicated because of your history with her, but I'm hoping you can be happy for us. I laughed bitterly. Happy for you? Mason, you've been lying to me for months. You've been dating my ex-girlfriend while pretending to be my supportive friend. You've been gathering information about my feelings for her while pursuing her behind my back. And now you want my blessing to marry her? Mason looked hurt by my reaction. I was hoping you'd understand, he said. Sophia and I are good together. We have a lot in common, and we make each other happy. Isn't that what matters? What matters, I said, standing up, is that you betrayed our friendship in the worst possible way. What matters is that you chose to pursue the one person you knew would hurt me the most. What matters is that you've been lying to my face for months while I trusted you completely. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mason said, but his tone suggested he thought I was being unreasonable. I was hoping we could all be mature about this situation. Sophia and I want you to be part of our lives going forward. Part of your lives, I repeated incredulously. You want me to watch you marry my ex-girlfriend and pretend like everything is normal? Mason nodded like this was a perfectly reasonable request. We could all be friends again eventually, he said. Once you've had time to process everything and maybe find someone new yourself. I told Mason to get out of my apartment and that our friendship was over. He tried to argue that I was overreacting and that I'd change my mind once I'd calmed down. He said Sophia had been worried about how I'd take the news, but that she hoped we could all move past this awkwardness. The fact that they discussed my potential reaction made everything worse. They'd been planning how to manage my feelings while conducting their secret relationship. They'd probably laughed about how oblivious I was and how easy it had been to deceive me. After Mason left, I called in sick to work and spent the day trying to figure out how to move forward. I felt like I'd lost my best friend and my ex-girlfriend all over again, except this time the pain was compounded by the betrayal and deception involved. I'd been mourning a relationship that ended honestly while being manipulated by two people I'd trusted completely. 3 days later, I received a text from Sophia asking if we could talk. She said Mason had told her about our conversation and that she wanted to explain her side of things. She suggested we meet for coffee like civilized adults to clear the air between us. I agreed to meet her partly because I wanted answers and partly because I was curious about how she'd try to justify what they'd done. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Sophia was already there looking nervous but determined. She'd always been good at presenting herself as reasonable and rational, even when her behavior was anything but. "Oliver," she said as I sat down, "I want you to know how sorry I am about the way this happened. Mason and I never intended to hurt you." "But you did hurt me," I replied. "You both made deliberate choices that you knew would hurt me, and you did it anyway." Sophia sighed. "You're right, and I take responsibility for that. But I need you to understand that what Mason and I have is real. This isn't some rebound relationship or a way to get back at you. We genuinely fell in love. While you were supposedly taking a break to figure out what you wanted," I said. "While I was respecting your decision and giving you space to grow, you were developing feelings for my best friend." "It wasn't planned," Sophia insisted. "Mason reached out to check on me after we broke up, and we started talking about everything we were both going through. We discovered we had more in common than we'd realized when we were all hanging out together." "More in common than we had?" I asked. Sophia hesitated before answering. "Oliver, you're a wonderful person, but Mason and I connect on a different level. We have similar goals and ambitions. We both want to travel and experience new things. We're both willing to take risks for what we want." Translation: I was too boring and predictable for her. Mason was more exciting and adventurous. The same qualities that had made our friendship work, complementary personalities and different strengths, were apparently what made Mason a better romantic match for Sophia. Then Sophia dropped the news that would set everything in motion for what came next. She told me that Mason had proposed the night before and that she'd said yes. She showed me the engagement ring and said they were planning a wedding for the following spring. She said she hoped I'd consider being part of their celebration despite everything that had happened. I looked at her sitting there with another man's ring on her finger, asking me to celebrate her engagement to my former best friend, and felt something shift inside me. They'd both made their choices, and now they'd have to live with the consequences. What came next would teach them both that some betrayals carry a price they never saw coming. I congratulated Sophia on her engagement and told her I hoped she and Mason would be very happy together. She seemed surprised by my calm reaction and thanked me for being so understanding about their situation. She said it meant a lot to both of them that I was handling everything so maturely. What Sophia didn't know was that I'd already decided exactly how I was going to handle their betrayal. I wasn't going to make a scene or try to break them up or seek some dramatic revenge. Instead, I was going to give them exactly what they'd asked for: my blessing and support, while making sure they understood the full cost of what they'd chosen. Over the next few weeks, I started reaching out to mutual friends and family members to share the news about Mason and Sophia's engagement. I was careful to present the information in a factual, neutral way that didn't make me look bitter or vindictive. I simply told people that my childhood best friend had proposed to my ex-girlfriend and that they'd been secretly dating for several months before telling anyone. The reaction was swift and unanimous. Everyone who knew our history was shocked and disgusted by what Mason and Sophia had done. My parents were furious that Mason had betrayed our friendship after being treated like family for over 20 years. Mason's own parents were embarrassed and disappointed when they learned how their son had conducted himself. Our college friends were equally appalled. These were people who'd witnessed our friendship firsthand and who'd seen how devastated I was after my breakup with Sophia. They couldn't believe that Mason had been pursuing her while comforting me about losing her. Several of them reached out to tell me they'd no longer be maintaining friendships with either Mason or Sophia. But the real damage came when I shared the story with Sophia's graduate school friends and professors. I'd kept in touch with a few people from her program, and when I mentioned her engagement to my former best friend, the news spread quickly through her academic circles. Suddenly, everyone in her program knew that she'd left one relationship to immediately pursue another with her ex-boyfriend's best friend. The social consequences were devastating for both of them. Mason found himself ostracized by our hometown friend group and extended social circle. People who'd known him since childhood were questioning his character and integrity. His coworkers learned about the situation and began treating him differently. Even his family members were keeping their distance. Sophia faced similar social fallout in her graduate program. Her classmates and professors viewed her behavior as manipulative and unethical. Several people questioned whether someone who would treat personal relationships so callously could be trusted in professional settings. Her reputation in a small competitive academic program was permanently damaged. But I wasn't finished yet. I started documenting every interaction I'd had with Mason during the period when he was secretly pursuing Sophia. I saved text messages where he'd encouraged me to move on from her while he was actively trying to win her over. I compiled evidence of his lies and manipulation that painted a clear picture of his systematic betrayal of our friendship. I also reached out to Sophia's ex-boyfriends from before our relationship and discovered that she had a pattern of overlapping relationships and emotional affairs. She'd cheated on previous partners by developing feelings for new people before ending her current relationships. What had happened between us wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a consistent pattern of behavior. Armed with this information, I created a detailed timeline of events that showed exactly how Mason and Sophia had conducted their secret relationship. I shared this documentation with key people in both their social circles, making sure everyone understood the calculated nature of their betrayal. The pressure mounted over the following months. Mason's job performance suffered as he struggled with the social isolation and professional consequences of his actions. Several important business relationships became strained when clients learned about his personal conduct. His reputation in our small town was permanently damaged. Sophia's academic standing began to suffer as well. Professors who'd previously supported her work became distant and critical. Fellowship opportunities she'd been considered for disappeared without explanation. Other students in her program avoided collaborating with her on projects. But the final blow came when I revealed something that neither Mason nor Sophia knew I'd discovered. During my investigation into their relationship timeline, I'd learned that Mason had actually been in contact with Sophia before our official breakup. Phone records showed they'd been talking regularly during the final month of my relationship with her when she was picking fights and creating distance between us. I shared this evidence with their families and closest friends, showing that their relationship hadn't begun innocently after our breakup, as they'd claimed. Mason had been actively pursuing Sophia while she was still in a committed relationship with me and had likely influenced her decision to end things between us. The revelation destroyed any remaining sympathy people had for their situation. Even those who'd been willing to accept that sometimes feelings develop unexpectedly couldn't excuse the timeline that showed premeditated betrayal and manipulation. 6 months after their engagement, Mason and Sophia's relationship began to crumble under the weight of social isolation and constant scrutiny. They found themselves cut off from most of their support systems and dealing with professional consequences neither had anticipated. The stress of defending their relationship to skeptical friends and family members created tension between them. Mason started drinking heavily and became increasingly paranoid that people were talking about him behind his back. Sophia's academic performance continued to decline as she struggled with depression and anxiety about her reputation. They began fighting frequently about whose fault it was that everyone had turned against them. 8 months after Mason's proposal, Sophia called off the engagement. She told him she couldn't handle the social isolation anymore and that she blamed him for not anticipating how people would react to their relationship. She said she was transferring to a different graduate program in another state to start fresh somewhere no one knew their story. Mason called me the day after Sophia left town. He was drunk and crying, asking me to forgive him and trying to rebuild our friendship. He said he realized he'd made a terrible mistake and that losing both Sophia and our friendship wasn't worth whatever he'd thought he was gaining. I listened to him ramble for a few minutes, then told him exactly what I thought. "Mason, you didn't just make a mistake," I said. "You made a series of deliberate choices over many months that showed you cared more about getting what you wanted than about honoring our friendship or treating me with basic respect." I told him that forgiveness wasn't something he could demand and that trust once broken couldn't be easily rebuilt. I said I hoped he'd learned something from the experience, but that our friendship was permanently over. Mason moved away 3 months later, unable to rebuild his life in a town where everyone knew what he'd done. Sophia never finished her graduate program and, last I heard, was working at a coffee shop in a city where no one knows her academic background. As for me, I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't trying to destroy someone's happiness, but simply making sure everyone knows exactly who they really are. Mason and Sophia got exactly what they wanted each other, but they also got exactly what they deserved: complete social isolation and the knowledge that their betrayal had consequences they never anticipated. Some people aren't worth the pain they cause, and some betrayals reveal truths about character that can never be forgiven or forgotten.